where we go from here. Hey, we're working this morning, Toby. Toby. So what we find out, the Baptists start in the 17th century. The General Baptists start about 1609 with John Smith, 1611 with Thomas Helwys, the first General Baptist church on British soil. By the beginning of the 18th century, General Baptists are in decline. Notice 146 churches, 1715, 35 years later, 60. Where are the churches? Well, some of them closed. Some of them became particular Baptists. We're going to meet a man this morning, Abraham Booth, that actually became a particular Baptist. So Baptists started forming associations of churches. Churches are small. It's hard for small churches to do much on their own. So they started networking and forming associations of churches, in part to exercise some control, trying to keep their fellow churches in tow. They had discussions over cockfighting, over gambling, over dancing, immorality, and slavery became issues. By the way, we're going to see in Baptist life, slavery is one of the major issues that Baptists have to contend with. And wouldn't you know it, some believed in it, and others repudiated it. Another reason for division. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention, which was formed in 1845, was formed over the issue of slavery. Our Southern brethren, Jason went to a racist seminary. I'm tongue-in-cheek. In part, the brethren who started the seminary, Southern Seminary in 1859, were slaveholders and supported slaveholding and worked for the Confederacy, which was pro-slavery. And slavery was a major issue that divided Baptists. So they were divided on theology and practice and social issues. There are as many reasons for Baptist division as there are kinds of Baptists. And that's part of the challenge. So there was division. There was also the problem with error. Arianism. Arianism was the doctrine that Christ wasn't God. And they had a Baptist minister in Sussex in the 18th century, a man named Hadden, who began to teach Arianism in his church, and the General Baptists argued over whether Matthew Caffin should be disfellowshipped, kicked out. And actually, some General Baptist churches left the General Baptist because they didn't want to be associated with Matthew Caffin and his Arianism. Another cause. And, again, division again and again. The General Baptists failed to deal with the Matthew Caffin affair when it first appeared in 1693. Some of the churches split to form a general association to clear themselves and the congregations to which they belong of those gross errors. So they began to divide one from another. There were two General Baptist groups for 34 years. After Calvin died, they reunited. And a well-known historian of Baptist life said, thus, the General Baptist chose denominational unity at the expense of doctrine. Now, this is going to be one of the great lessons of Baptist history. When do we break away? And when do we stay? The Southern Baptist Convention right now is embroiled in such a controversy. In fact, they've got several things on the docket, which I'll share with you in our last session, that is threatening the unity of the Southern Baptist Convention. Baptists don't get along with each other, so they start new churches. Well, in the early 18th century, a man named Dan Taylor came on the scene, and Dan Taylor was influenced by John and Charles Wesley and the First Great Awakening. And he became a believer, raised an Anglican, became a committed Methodist in 1757, and eventually was convinced that immersion was the right form of baptism, and he sought to be immersed, but the particular Baptist wouldn't immerse him because he was an Arminian. We're not immersing any Arminians. And so he found a General Baptist to immerse him, and he starts a new branch of the General Baptist because he sees the theological decay among what was left of the old original General Baptist, and he forms a new group of General Baptists that we call the New Connection. He held a high Christology, that is, he believed that Jesus was the Son of God. He did not hold to Arianism. So that was Daniel Taylor. Divisions. Division. Another reason for division was communion. Now, let me ask you a question. What's the purpose of it? Of what? Okay, for who? Okay, for believers. So when we come to the Lord's table, we come together. And what happens if we in the assembly are out of sorts with each other? What are we supposed to do? Well, that's ultimately that, but more importantly, reconcile. The table is intended to encourage us to reconcile and then partake together. The table is a place of unity. How can you be united at the table if you don't agree? And one of the principal agreements was who should take the Lord's table. What are the choices? Well, you can slow the invite table. Open communion. Now, theoretically, you have to be a Christian to take communion because communion supposedly means something to someone. But we're not worried about that. However, there are many Baptists, myself included, would argue that baptism is one of two ordinances Jesus left to the church that are requirements for believers. Is baptism an optional thing? Are Christians obligated to get married? No. Now, I highly recommend it. But there's no obligation. There's no biblical mandate to marry. Now, the Bible does warn you that it's better to marry than to burn with lust. So there are some distinct advantages to it. But there's no biblical requirement if you don't get married. But is baptism a biblical requirement? And if it is, who's required it? Matthew 28:19. Jesus told his disciples to make disciples. What's a disciple? Well, look at the text. Somebody who's been baptized and is learning to observe all things. When I read the scripture, we're not called to go out and win converts. We're called to go out and make disciples. What's the difference? It's not just walking down, what's the street over here that the Fuller Van Belly's on? Yeah, it's not just walking down Central, buttonholing Muslims to get into the prayer, sinner's prayer, and find out the next one. We're to make disciples. A disciple is a follower. And how do you know when someone is a disciple? What's the first sign of discipleship? Metaphorically speaking, we're baptized. Baptism is a sign of discipleship. And what kind of sign is it? It's an entrance sign. Jesus said, "Go and make disciples, baptizing and instructing." Baptism was the first act of obedience. Baptists argued, if that's true, and communion came far down the road, communion is only for disciples baptized. Now, again, that's one of those worms that I'll just leave on the table. I don't know what your practice is as a church. I'm not trying to argue against the practice of the church. I'm just telling you the historic Baptist discussion on communion. And churches, Abraham Booth writes a book, An Apology for the Baptist. The word apology comes from the Greek word apologia. It means a defense. It doesn't mean, oh, I'm sorry for being a Baptist. It's a defense for being a Baptist, in which he defends close communion. Communion only for credo immersed. Again, a cause of division. Robert Hall Sr. is an interesting fellow. We're coming to our friend William Carey here in a minute. And there was a story told about high Calvinism that Robert Hall Sr., William Carey, when he was a young lad and enjoying ministerial fellowship, was trying to get his brethren to consider the world and do world evangelism. And someone argued that Robert Hall Sr. said, well, sit down. When God wants to save the lost, he'll save them without your help or mine. Whether or not that's a true story, Robert Hall Sr. was a very well-known Baptist of the day of William Carey, wrote a book, Help to Zion's Travelers. We're going to meet his son here in a minute, John Rippon. John Rippon was pastor of a Baptist church, helped run Bristol Baptist College, from which he graduated. He did a lot of preserving early Baptist history. He helped the American patriots in their cause during the War for Independence. But we really want to know about William Carey. I'm going to switch chairs here. Sorry to rearrange your platform. William Carey is the guy we all really want to talk about this morning. One of the great heroes of the Baptist faith. We come now to the end of the 18th century in English Baptism. And by and large, there's not much going on as far as world evangelism is concerned. Why not? Well, you have to appreciate, I have taught in Romania, Ukraine, Moscow, India, China, Zambia, Kenya, Russia. I can get on a plane at Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I can be anywhere in the world in about 30 hours. And flight cancellations. 30 hours. You can be anywhere in the world. In a day without airplanes, steamships, trains, automobiles, how long would it take to get from here to Chicago? It's about a 7 hour, 6 to 7 hours, depending on traffic. How long would it take to walk to Chicago? Or to ride a horse to Chicago? Or a wagon? So the logistics of world evangelism were really in the 18th century. And we're talking about months. And the journey was arduous. Pirates, shipwreck, storms, delays, arduous. There was no efficient means of global travel until the age of shipping, transoceanic shipping. I mean, Columbus, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We're just now getting into the age of shipping at the beginning. But even then, there's not a lot of transoceanic. Figure out how to keep wooden vessels together crossing these vast waters. Then they couldn't just look up on Google Maps to get directions on how to get there. I put into my phone last night, and I've been here to the church a number of times. I know I've eaten at the Holy Land Deli a number of times. I knew generally where the church was, but I didn't want to trust last night's rival to my poor memory. So I put into my Waze app All Nations Baptist Church so that I could get here in a timely fashion. And it took me about 20 minutes to drive from Plymouth over here, 9 or 10 miles. But what did these travelers have 400 years ago? They had vague knowledge of foreign lands, limited access to global shipping, limited to no knowledge of foreign languages. Today, a missionary wants to go to the foreign mission field. He can buy, what's the name of that online language app? Rosetta Stone. And he can begin to learn German, Italian, French, Russian. There was no efficient way. So, part of the reason there's no global missions movement is because there's no mechanism to it. But in the aftermath of the Reformation, Christians began to understand a responsibility of carrying the gospel to the ends of the earth. Baptists, who start in the early 1600s, nobody sent, All Nations Baptist Church, you're not going to send out 40 missionaries. You don't have the capacity to do that. Now, you may want to do it. You may have a goal to do that at some point. But you don't have the capacity. Baptist churches were small when they got started. There were no mega churches. Part of the reason they formed associations is one church couldn't do it, 2 churches couldn't do it, 4 churches couldn't do it, 8 churches couldn't do it. But you get a dozen or 15 churches together, now we can start doing something. William Carey goes to a pastor's meeting at the home of B.B. Wallace. Mrs. B.B. Wallace opened her home up. And finally, he persuades his brethren. Are we going to do anything for missions? They take up an offering. 13 pounds, 2 shillings, 6 cents. Like you've got 13 pounds. Have you checked on the price of a boat ticket to India lately? But it's a start. It's a start. He needs help. Enter Andrew Fuller. Andrew Fuller is a self-taught brother, pastors in Kettering, sometimes called the Lion of Kettering. He's a prodigious author. He writes a book, Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. Now, here's part of the problem that's going on in British Baptist, particular Baptist life. If God's going to save the elect, does he need your help and mine? Are you asking me, or are you making a declarative statement? Okay. Yeah, but that was the disciples. That doesn't apply to us. Huh? See, this is part of the discussion. Just because the apostles did something doesn't mean we do. And eventually they come up with the so-called modern question, which is, should we even offer the gospel to unbelievers? Can I even say in my sermon tomorrow morning, Christ died for you? How do I know if you're one of the elect? Now I can see, tell me your name, brother. I can see Daniel's forehead. He's kind of pretty exposed there. And I don't see an E tattooed in his forehead. So I'm going to assume that Daniel isn't one of the elect. Amy, she's got her hair pulled down with bangs, so there may be an E up under there somewhere. How do we know who the elect are? No. And so this becomes the question. Now, Andrew Fuller says we got to preach the gospel. The gospel is worthy of every acceptance. One of the great Baptist theological treatises. I'm sure Michael Hadden. Did he have you read it? I mean, Michael Hadden is a big. Michael Hadden, who pastor studied at Southern, has what's called the Andrew Fuller Center because he really likes Andy Fuller. And Andrew Fuller was the theological powerhouse behind the modern missionary movement. We often hear of William Carey, but Andrew Fuller had as much to do with the British Foreign Mission Society as William Carey did. Andrew Fuller preached in his own church and walked all over the British Isles raising money for missions. He was a Calvinist, but he wasn't a dogmatic hyper-Calvinist. Now, another cause of division is the extent to which one holds the doctrines of grace. Do you know what a hyper-Calvinist is? It's anybody who believes more of Calvin than I do. I mean, this is interesting. Remember I told you about my friend who said I'd be a Calvinist if you let me define the terms? Well, the terms have standard definitions. Limited atonement. And sometimes we use the acrostic TULIP, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. These have standard definitions. Theoretically, a Calvinist is somebody who holds all 5 points. But we have so-called 4-point Calvinists, 3.5-point Calvinists, 7-point Calvinists. I think John Piper is something like a 7-point Calvinist. And I'm not speaking for John. I think that's what I've heard said about him. He's got some additional things that he thinks are important. Typically, down through the ages, hyper-Calvinism has been leveled at people who hold to all 5 points. That is not hyper-Calvinism. Hyper-Calvinist is somebody who will not offer the gospel indiscriminately. I'm not going to give you a gospel tract because I don't know if you're one of the elect. And I wouldn't want to offer you something that you can't enjoy. Hard-shell Baptist? Primitive Baptist? Don't believe in preaching to the lost. How can we preach to someone and invite them to Christ if Christ doesn't intend to save them? Yes, sir. Yes. Means not preaching to anybody that you don't know is preached. Now, I hesitate in answering your question simply because preaching to children is not, that's a relatively late theological vintage. We're talking about preaching to adults for most of this. There wasn't the same kind of child evangelism back in these days as we have now. Parents were expected to bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of Christ. So preaching to children wasn't the same kind of theological importance that it is today. Anyway, Andrew Fuller was William Carey's theological assistant, if you will, in promoting the cause of missions. He took on a number of other theological issues in his day: Sandemanianism, hyper-Calvinism, basically Sandemanianism, thank you. Sandemanianism taught bare belief. It was just sort of mental assent, which was false doctrine. He took on Sandemanianism, and he made the famous "I'll hold the." Carey, said, "I'll go down into the well if you hold the ropes." He held the ropes by providing financial support, and it was the beginning of the Baptist Foreign Mission Society. Another pastor that was very involved was Samuel Pierce, a very saintly man, died fairly young, died at 33 years old, but a very saintly man. We come to William Carey. William Carey is a guy you've got to know something about. His country of opportunity is India. Now, the question is, why India? Because it's a British trading colony. I mentioned before that transportation is an issue. It's much easier to go where the train lines are running. Excuse the metaphor. The British East India Company, they're sending ships back and forth to India for spices, for rubber, for silk. Carey figures, and there are Brits now who are going from England and living in some of these colonies. Early missionaries often were simply clergymen who would go to the colonies to start churches among the expats. British subjects needed Anglican churches living in India. Well, others said, well, what about reaching the locals? What about reaching the nationals? And so Carey, it was interesting because one of the early obstacles that missionaries faced is they had a hard time buying transportation. Not because there weren't enough places going, and not because they didn't want to take travelers, paying travelers on board ship, but the missionaries often interfered with the trading. Because you know what the traders did? They took advantage of these young nationals. I worked during my first ministry up in Canada on an Indian reserve. And when the traders began to trade things to the Indians for beaver fur pelts, prized beaver pelts that were taken to Europe and made into garments. They wanted to buy a firearm. They had to stack beaver pelts up to the top of the muzzle. That's how much a firearm cost. Now we're talking about paying for the gun 10 times over in terms of was very common for the European to take advantage of the indigenous populations. Missionaries came in and said, don't do that. That's worth far more than what you're selling it for. Or when the missionaries saw heathen practices, pagan practices. Now, in today's modern world, nobody wants to call it pagan. I remember years ago, I was knocking on doors for a church, just doing some evangelism. I asked a lady to answer the door. She said, well, I'm not a pagan. Wow, okay, I'll take your word for it. I don't know if you are or not. The reality is you either believe in Jesus Christ or you don't. If you don't believe in Jesus Christ, call yourself what you want, but you're not a believer, according to the Scripture. Here were these locals, Hindus, who practiced such things as sati. When the husband died, the wife was killed and burned on his funeral pyre so he would have company, someone to cook his food in the next life. It was barbarous. And Carey and company objected to that, which angered the locals because now these Europeans are interfering with their religious practices, and now it's hindering the trading with other Brits. And so the British traders didn't want the missionaries going because the missionaries created problems for the traders. I mean, it's a difficult situation. William Carey was a cobbler. He is self-taught. He learns Latin on his own in 1773. He begins his spiritual journey in 1776. He leaves the Church of England, 1779. He marries a couple of years later. He begins preaching in 1782. He is immersed by John Ryland in 1783. His son Felix, who becomes his assistant in India, is born in 1785. He tries to be ordained. In Carey's day, you had to preach an ordination sermon as part of your ordination process. And if you didn't preach a good enough sermon, the council wouldn't ordain you. You know, sometimes I think we ought to practice that again, because I've heard some young guys get ordained that preach really poorly. Well, they wouldn't ordain him. He eventually pastors the Harvey Lane Baptist Church. 1792 is the pivotal year when Baptist Foreign Missionary Society begins. In May, he preaches a sermon, an inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathen. Just because you're a Calvinist doesn't mean God can't use you as a means of accomplishing his will. We become a hammer in the hands of God for pounding the nails that he wants pounded. We become a spokesman for the Word of God, for the message God wants declared. Since we don't know who the elect are, when we witness, we may become the means whereby God introduces himself to those that are lost. In 1792, he preaches a sermon, Expect Great Things, Attempt Great Things, and in October he helps form the Baptist Missionary Society, the first corporate cooperative Baptist effort to evangelize. In January 1793, he's commissioned. In June of 1793, he sails. Interesting thing about it, he goes home one day and he says to his wife, "I'm going to India." She said, "Have fun. See you when you get back." She didn't want to go with him. When he leaves, she doesn't go. The ship gets out to sea, has some structural problems, has to go back in to port to fix them. He has some time on his hands, so he goes back home and persuades his wife to go. Unfortunately, Carey's wife's journey to India was fraught with problems. She did not like being there, and she actually had a mental breakdown. She dies. He marries Charlotte Rumor in 1808. He completes a variety of New Testaments. His second wife dies. He marries a third time. Very, as a matter of interest, in these early generations of missions, many of the missionaries died, and more of their wives. The well-known story of Adoniram Jensen and Hasseltine. Judson tells Anne's father, "If you give me permission to marry your daughter, I'm going to take her where God opens. You never see her." And he did. They sailed not long after they were married, and her parents never saw her. She died. Very, very, very. The sacrifices that were made for gospel advance were significant. My oldest son, I have 3 children. My daughter is married in Charleston, lives in Charleston, South Carolina. They have no children. By there, they just don't want to have children. And they live in Charleston. She's 38. My second oldest child is a son. He went to Africa, serving at Central African Baptist University, School of Bible there. He had the nerve to take all 4 children to Africa. The nerve of him. Who does he think he is? Now, the blessing is, in this day and age, they just got him like a Facebook account or a messenger account, so now he can call us, and we can talk with him regularly. But can you imagine the hardship that these early families endured when their loved ones left and they never saw them? It was significant. Carey's, he lost his first wife, second wife, third wife. Anyway, look at the list of accomplishments that Carey accomplished. Translated the Bible in 6 languages, portions of 9 others. Jason has a hard time translating Greek. How'd you do in Greek, Jason? You still read your Greek New Testament? Good for you. You read your Hebrew? Good for you. Good for you. I don't do either one. I had Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Now I can pick up a critical commentary, and I know what the technical ideas are. And if I had to, I could work my way through a passage. But I'm a church historian. A guy can't know everything. You can't know everything. You can't master everything. And I remember when I was doing my PhD at Southern, I had to have, in addition to Greek and Hebrew, which I got in seminary, I had to have knowledge of German and French and pass exams. Not because I would use German. I was a historian of American Christianity. And while there is a little bit of German in American Christianity, I was just taking the class to take it. It was a rite of passage. Translating into 6 languages, that's a pretty significant. William Carey was a polyglot. He just had tremendous abilities. Completed grammars of 7 languages. A grammar is just a description of how the language works. Subject, verb, object, where they're placed in the sentence, parts of speech. That's all a grammar is. It's just describing how the language works. He never took a furlough. He was in India 41 years and never returned home. The communion debate in England made its way all the way. What do you do about having communion? He was assisted by 3 colleagues. John Thomas went with him initially. He was a physician. Unfortunately, the money that was sent with him, he burned through trying to outfit his surgical office. So Carey had to go to work. He went to work running an indigo farm. He went to work running a college. Joshua Marshman came to assist Carey. His wife, Hannah, helped care for William Carey's wife, Dorothy, when she went stir-crazy. William Ward was Carey's other assistant, the so-called Serampore trio, Carey, Marshman, and Ward. Ward was the publisher. He ran the printing. It's one thing to translate the scripture into these languages. It's another thing to print the books so that people can read the scriptures. And that was William Ward's task. Among the challenges to life in ancient India, I've already alluded to sati. There was also infanticide. They would take babies and throw them into the Ganges River, offer them as sacrifice. There was self-torture, where they would hang themselves on hooks. This is Hinduism. And then there was the caste system and slavery. All of these things Christians had to confront. And what was Christianity going to do in the face of all of this? They couldn't look the other way. How could the Christians look the other way? They couldn't. They had to speak out against it. Last slide in this presentation, then we'll take a brief break, is one more Baptist you ought to know, and that is Christmas Evans. Why do you suppose his first name is Christmas? This is one of the great Welsh Baptists. A fervent evangelist, did much to spread the Baptist cause in Wales. There were Baptists in other of the British kingdoms. The Haldane brothers in Scotland. Baptists began to grow exponentially. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll go to the United States. Take 5. Okay, we're going to switch centuries again. There's far more material, even in what I outlined to Jason. We're not going to cover everything, just simply because, I mean, there's just so much material and so much I'm leaving out as a part of this. But it'll give you a good motivation to read further on some of this. But I want to talk about 19th century Baptists, particularly in the United States. You remember that we talked a little bit about communion. I want to put this up here, the relationship of communion and baptism. And here, I'm going to sit back here where I can see this and read these. Why do churches insist, why did Baptists insist on strict communion or close communion? And here are some of the arguments. The order of the ordinances in the New Testament. Baptism always came first. There was no such thing as an unbaptized disciple. So, everybody that took communion was baptized. Number two, the place of baptism in the Great Commission. It's a part of becoming a disciple. Number three, the apostolic practice. If you look in the book of Acts, baptism and then communion. All denominations agree. This was another argument. In the Catholic Church, when does a child take communion? Not until it's been baptized. This is true in other liturgical churches. Baptism precedes communion. And then the final argument here, to insist on the teaching of the Lord is neither uncharitable nor divisive. It is simple obedience to biblical instructions. It's not being divisive to insist that baptism precede communion. And so this was an early Baptist argument for communion and a strict approach to communion. Those who argued for it being open said, without denying the obvious biblical injunction, what if it is not convenient to be baptized? Should that person be refused? Now, obviously, living here in Minnesota, do you have a baptistry in the church? Is that a baptistry there? It's underneath the coffee. Oh, is it a portable baptistry? Okay. What do churches do? What about, what if it's not convenient? Okay, that was one argument. Number two, the two ordinances are not organically connected and can be viewed separate from each other. Number three, while it is true that the apostolic church baptism came first, we're not under biblical obligation to do so. Number four, the majority of Christians practice this. So what? That is an argument ad secundum, a veracundum. It is an attempt to overawe by the weight of the evidence or the weight of authority. So what? So what if everybody does it? That'd make it right. Brotherly love suggests that we shouldn't bar people from the communion table. The scriptures enjoin toleration for different opinions. Paedo-Baptists are part of the true church, and exclusion is unwarranted. Unnecessary division among believers is a scandal. Now, wind the clock ahead to 2006. 2006, Bethlehem Baptist Church of the Twin Cities here, under the leadership of John Piper, put forth a proposition that they would admit people into their church membership who had not been immersed. In part because they couldn't minister to people who weren't a part of their body. They believed that Calvinism, they took a strong stand on Calvinism, but they didn't require Calvinism as a condition of membership, so why should they require immersion? I happened to go to the church meeting. It was on a Wednesday night, and listened to John make his case. And it was an interesting discussion. They received pushback from sort of across Baptist denominations. Tom Schreiner, who used to be a part of Bethlehem, and I forget who else, pushed back with that. And he tried to use Wayne Grudem's book, Systematic Theology, to prove his point. And Wayne Grudem actually revised his systematic theology because it appeared that Wayne allowed for that position, but he said that wasn't what I was trying to do. It was a very interesting story. They never did change the membership requirements at Bethlehem. So these are things that continue to agitate in Baptist life to this day. Whether to commune with all Christians or just obedient Christians. Now, I'll say this. You know the name Ligon Duncan? Great preacher. He's a Presbyterian. It's interesting. When I was at Southern Seminary, the archivist there, Sean Lucas was the archivist at Southern Seminary when I was studying. And we were talking one day about Calvinism and the sign of the covenant. And I said to him, Sean, so how do you embrace covenant theology and not have the sign of the covenant, which is infant baptism? He said, well, actually, my family and I are becoming Presbyterians. They did. He's pastor in Hattiesburg, Mississippi now, Presbyterian congregation, and works with Ligon Duncan. It's an interesting tension that continues to cause challenges among the brethren. Mark Dever, I think, practices close communion. I don't think he would commune with Ligon Duncan. Though they're friends, they see themselves differently because of the ordinance. It's just one of those areas of difference among Baptists and others. Calvinism is another one of those issues. And here's our friend Andrew Fuller again. There was high Calvinism, bordering on antinomianism. There was moderate Calvinism, Amyraldianism, hypothetical universalism, and there was strict Calvinism, which was Fuller's view. And under the issue of Fuller was two things: the free offer of the gospel. Can we offer Christ? Can I stand in your pulpit tomorrow and say Christ died for all? Now, did he die for all men without exception? Or all kinds of men without distinction? Red and yellow, black and white. Again, that's one of those worms on the table. Honestly, there's just not time to study these issues out in detail. Even when I teach a seminary level course on this, all you can do is hit the highlights and say, look, you're going to have to take some of these issues out of theology class because there's just far too much theological conversation that needs to be taking place in solving these. And even then, some of these issues can't be solved. We're just not going to agree on them. The modern question, and we're coming to Charles Hadden Spurgeon. And we come to Charles Hadden Spurgeon in the context of Calvinism. Charles Hadden Spurgeon was fervently evangelistic and dogmatically Calvinist, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but in Spurgeon, it was a beautiful connection. But in the days running up to Spurgeon, you had all of this very strong Calvinism. Tobias Crisp, Joseph Hussey, God's operation of grace, but no offers of his grace. William Huntington, the moral law was for unbelievers only. There were certain things that didn't apply to unbelievers. John Skepp was an early Baptist. His book, The Divine Energy, or the Efficacious Operations of the Spirit of God in the Soul of Man in His Effectual Calling and Conversion. You got to love the titles of some of these books. He had influence on John Gill. That's who I really John Gill. John Gill was a predecessor to Charles Hadden Spurgeon, one of the great theological minds of his day. John Gill, in this question of hyper-Calvinism, has often been accused of being a hyper-Calvinist. Did Hadden talk much about Gill? Yeah, probably a lot. He wrote a book on Gill. The question is, does man have a duty to believe? Humanity. Does he have a duty to believe? Does the preacher have a responsibility to preach the gospel to all people? Now, in the days immediately preceding Charles Hadden Spurgeon, they're actually arguing about this in pastors' fellowships. Should the apostolic pattern of preaching to the unconverted be followed by modern ministers? This is what William Gadsby said. We believe that it would be unsafe, from the brief records we have of the way which the weather was too bad, so we turned down an alley and visited another church, and the minister wasn't even there. And when from Isaiah 54, I think it was, look unto me, all ye the ends of the earth, and be saved, and sort of pointed Spurgeon out. And Spurgeon became a Christian. And then he realized he needed to be baptized, and he sought out baptism at the hands of a Baptist minister. And when his mother found out he'd been baptized in a Baptist church, his mother said, I always prayed for you, Charles, that you'd become a Christian, but not that you'd become a Baptist. To which Charles said, isn't God good, Mother? He often gives us more than what we ask for. At the age of 17, he begins preaching at Water Beach. He's called at the age of 19 to the New Park Street Church in London, a church of about 200 members. It would eventually become the Metropolitan Tabernacle. He begins preaching. His life is just filled with stunning successes. Starts a pastor's college in 1857. What's interesting is somebody suggested Spurgeon go to school. He was up for it. He was to meet the director, the president of a particular school, and had arranged for an appointment, and he went to a layman's house and was seated by a servant girl in one room. The man he was to meet came a few minutes later and was seated by a servant girl in another room. They both waited for each other until the principal had to leave. thought Spurgeon wasn't going to show up. He was in the house in another room, and he took that as God's will that he shouldn't go to school. He was a voracious reader. He had a library of 12,000 volumes, and he read constantly. And he just never had a formal book-learned education. But one day, a young man wanted to be like Spurgeon, T.W. Medhurst, and he was preaching on the streets, and apparently he was doing a very poor job. And the long and the short of it was, they said, we got to get this man an education. And that was the impetus for Spurgeon starting the Pastors' College to help poor preachers learn to become better preachers. They built the tabernacle in 1861, total of 31,000 pounds, which was paid for. Spurgeon, by this time, was traveling the country preaching. He used his money to help build the building. He had his sermons were published every week in the penny pulpit. Two of his most well-known sermons were on baptismal regeneration, which he took on the Church of England, children brought to Christ, not to the font. He really wrangled the Church of England. Started a paper, The Sword and the Trowel, started a Cole Portage Association to disseminate literature. His wife, Susanna, who was an invalid, would often raise money and print books. Started a Stockwell Orphanage in 1867. This is the time of George Mueller and his orphanages in Bristol. One day, Spurgeon receives a note from an Anglican minister's wife. She wants to give him some money. Spurgeon says, give it to George Mueller. She said, no, I want to give it to you. I want you to start. She gives Spurgeon, I think it's 24,000 pounds. She said, why don't you give it to Mueller? Because I want you to start. A tidy sum of money to start. First, it was an orphanage for, I think the girls was first. No, the boys was first, and then the girls. 1887 was the downgrade controversy. There was theological chaos in the Baptist Union. Spurgeon eventually leaves the Baptist Union. Among the issues, here's another separation. Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species, 1859, is creating challenges among Christians. Biblical criticism, is the Bible the Word of God? What about all the miracles? I mean, Jesus didn't walk on water. Virgin birth? Who ever heard of a woman giving birth to a child without a biological male contributing? He was kicked out of the Baptist Union. In his paper, he published a series of articles on the downgrade, and this was before the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Now, technically, the fundamentalist modernist controversy took place in the United States from 1920 to about 1945. But this is in the late 19th century in England. But it's over theological liberalism. Another issue in Baptist life that's going to cause division. They formed the Baptist Union. And interesting thing about the Baptist Union, whenever you gather churches together to work cooperatively, you have to have common agreement. That means you have to decide what's important and what isn't. Hypothetically, could your church work with the Roman Catholic Church on any project? Okay, could you start churches together, Baptist and Roman Catholic? Why not? Because the theological differences are so profound. I remember years ago when I was in high-level Alberta, there was a discussion about starting a Bible study out on an Indian reserve and having the Catholic priest do 1 week and me doing another. And I said, I just don't know that that would really work. Because what I would teach 1 week, you would teach against the next, and what you would teach, I would teach against the following. Wouldn't that be confusing to people? Try to do that? You have to decide how much agreement you have to have with those whom you work. That's just the nature of agreement. The larger you want your people, your group to be, the fewer agreements you have to have, because, it's hard enough to get a church of 100 to agree on it. A church of 1,000? A church of 10,000? A denomination of 17,000 churches, that's about how big the Southern Baptist Convention is. The more you have, the fewer the lines of agreement. That's just the reality. Well, the Baptists in England begin to form a Baptist union, and the generals and the particulars get together, and what doctrine did they stop dividing over? The atonement. Which meant what? It really was harder on the particular redemption than on the general redemption. Well, they believed that everybody that the particulars believed included the atonement. They just added more people. So the issue, the surrender came on the part of the particular redemptionists. They had to give up their narrow view to join. And that's what happens with theological compromise. If a church that believes in women preachers works with a church that doesn't believe in women preachers, which side has to compromise? The one who doesn't. Now, you can say what the one who does, but they're just not going to. It's almost always the more conservative church that ends up compromising. Well, I want to switch. I'm going to go back here now and move some slides because I want to get to Adoniram Judson now. I'm going to have to leap around a little bit here, so I need to get to Adoniram Judson. Talk a little bit about American mission. And I'm talking about temporary death. Okay, the birth of American missions. The name that you should be familiar with here is Adoniram Judson. I just want to tick quickly through Judson here and talk a little bit about his story. I'll stand for a while because I'm going to be moving around just a little bit here in this regard. Judson is the name. Now we're into the 19th century. It's one of the problems with discussing Baptist history. You either discuss it thematically or you discuss it chronologically. And I tend to do both in my teaching simply because I try to keep some categories together and talk about others in order. Adoniram Judson is raised a Congregationalist. He's admitted into seminary. His father was a minister. He's admitted into seminary even though he is not a Christian. He goes to Andover Seminary. Even though he's not a Christian, He's converted. One day he was taking a trip, and he happened to check into a hotel room, an inn, and there was a man dying in the room next door, crying out for mercy. Died there. And when he checked out of the inn that next morning, the proprietor apologized to him for the situation. He said there was a man that died last night. And Jensen said, well, who was that? He found out it was one of his infidel friends who passed into eternity without a knowledge of Christ. He ended up becoming converted after he'd lived a somewhat profligate life. He devotes himself at the famous Haystack prayer meeting to become a missionary in 1809. He helps in the formation of the Congregational American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. He marries Anne Hasseltine. He says to Anne's dad, it's a very well-known quote. I don't have time to read it, about what he says to her father about leaving, never seeing her again. And he agrees. They get married, and a few days later, they sail for India. He originally goes to India. Now, he's going to be a missionary to Burma, but he originally goes to India. And she contracts liver difficulties, and she dies in India. When he gets to India, on board ship, headed to India, he decides to study the question of baptism, because he knows he's going to run into William Carey. And he wants to be able to discuss baptism. And he uses his Greek New Testament, and he studies baptism, and he becomes convinced of freedom of worship. When he gets to India, William Ward, the printer for Carey, baptizes Hadden. He's not going to be able to stay in India because India already had too many missionaries. The traders over there didn't want any more missionaries there. They already had problems with William Carey and Associates. He also doesn't have any funding, because now he's become a Baptist. The Congregationalists aren't going to be interested in funding his mission. So his colleague, Luther Rice, goes back to the United States, and they end up starting an American mission agency. And it's the birth of what starts off as the Triennial Convention. And it's going to become the beginning of American baptism, 1814, to fund Adoniram Judson. In the meantime, not having any place to live, you see from the map there, Burma is located around the Bay of Bengal. If we were to travel west, up, you see that's modern-day Myanmar. Burma is modern-day Myanmar. If you were to travel north, you see where India comes around. That's where that's where Carey is. And so he goes to Burma. Interestingly enough, one of the greatest missionary success stories of Judson. The Carey people. Thousands of converts, thanks to Adoniram. That's a story that is worth telling. We just don't have time to tell it. His first wife dies. Because he is a Westerner, because he is fluent in both English and the local language, they think he's a spy. He's arrested and imprisoned, but he's eventually released, and he's offered a job as a translator to help negotiate peace. This was another problem that foreigners had, is they were often mistrusted as spies. And the history of missions is really filled with tragic stories of Westerners who abuse their relationships with nationals. Returns to the United States. He's married 3 times. He marries Sarah Boardman, who is the wife of one of his colleagues who died. And then he comes back to the U.S. to bring his son back, and he marries a 3rd time, and she writes a biography of Anne Hasseltine. 30 years after his death, Burma had 7,000 converts and 63 churches. 100 years later, there were 200,000 converts, thanks to the work of Hadden and Jensen. His 2 great missionary endeavors: he helped to establish the church among the local people, and he helped to translate the scripture into the native Burmese language. Hadden Jensen was a great missionary statesman of the American cause. Questions or comments? Now, I want to switch again. Sorry, jumping around here a little bit. Because as we begin, I want to try to be done by 4 till, so we have time for conversation here at the end. There are going to be 2 issues which create great havoc in the United States among the Baptists. Last night, our sister asked us why there's so many divisions among the Baptists. And here's yet another cause for division. I've already summarized the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention over the issue of slavery. And when I come to a conclusion of this conversation this morning, the issue of racism is one of our current challenges. Is this considered North Minneapolis where we are here? What part of Minneapolis is this? Northeast Minneapolis. Okay. I don't live in Minneapolis, so north, south, you mentioned Roseville or you mentioned some of these communities, and I've been here 17 years. But honestly, I have very little sense of how Minneapolis is laid out. We live over on the west side, so obviously I know where Eden Prairie is, and I know where Maple Grove is, and those sort of western suburbs. But stuff over here, I know where White Bear Lake is, but I don't know a lot of these districts over here, except that I know that when you cross the bridge, you move over towards St. Paul. Now, why did I say that? I don't know. I probably had a reason. Oh, yeah. Minneapolis has had its share of trouble with racism. This is a historic problem. I'm not going to use the word systemic, because systemic makes it sound like it's part of our nature and we can't overcome it. And I would say that could be true of us, but as Christians, we are systemically sinners, but we can be sanctified by the Lord Jesus Christ, so that which we are inclined to do, we can choose not to do by the grace of God. Racism is a perennial problem in human history. My first ministry was among the Ojibwe Indians of Manitoba. I lived in the deep south, going to high school. I went to school with African Americans. But I honestly never was exposed, because my parents, my mother was Canadian, my father was from Pennsylvania. I don't remember any particular racist attitudes in my parents' speech. Now, We had lots of problems. My parents were social alcoholics. But I don't remember either of my parents using the N-word as an example. I just don't remember that. I don't remember. I remember going to school here and there with African Americans. I have not a great deal of recollection of the 1960s. I was born in 1956. So you talk about the 60s, which I lived through, the time of racial unrest. I was pretty small and don't remember a whole lot of that stuff. I remember in my mind's eye the funeral of JFK and seeing the riderless horse with the boots on backwards. It's a very well-known picture of Kennedy's funeral procession. I remember little John saluting his father's case on. But I don't remember a whole lot of the race riots and things like that. I didn't grow up in a particularly racist home that I know of. But I did live in the South. When I got out of college, I went to a college that did not admit African Americans when I first went. Now, that wasn't particularly unusual because lots of schools in the South didn't admit African Americans. Now, there were African Americans that worked in the school, and while I was there, African American students were admitted. There was no interracial dating, which I always thought was like, I never thought anything about. I mean, people interracially dated, black, white, yellow. What was the big deal? I just never thought anything about it. I go to Canada, and I'm working among the Ojibwe people, and the racism, the white hatred of the Indians was out. I one time said to one of my Indian friends, why is the reserve divided? One part lives the Catholics, the other part lives the Anglicans. He says, because of you white guys. You came in and divided us. Indians weren't allowed to speak their language in school. They were given white names. They were beaten for speaking their Ojibwe language. It was a horribly racist situation. So when we talk about the subject of racism, we're not just talking about black and white. We're talking about one group against another. America, as a nation, has been particularly plagued with black-white racism because of the problem of slavery. Slavery first comes to the United States in 1619. The first slaves are offloaded in Virginia in 1619. By the 1750s, slavery has become a social evil. Now, in the early days of the American experiment, how did they get sufficient numbers of people to work the land? People who were debtors in England were allowed to come to the New World to work off their debt, indentured servants. But that didn't give them enough laborers to work the land. So they started buying slaves. Slavery didn't start with the American experience. It didn't end with the American experience. Slavery exists in the world today. But during the apex of the African slave trade, America imported thousands of Africans. I forget the numbers. I think 25% of those who were put on board ship died en route to the New World. I had what was called the Triangle. They'd go from England to Africa, from Africa to the New World, from the New World to England. And each leg of the triangle, there would be a different cargo. The English would export things to Africa, and they would pick up slaves. They would bring slaves to the New World and sell them here, and then take commodities back to England. The Middle Passage was that passage from Africa to the United States. Thousands of slaves. By 1795, slaves are a problem. Baptists are among those who start denouncing slavery as problematic. Now, not all of them. There are many prominent Baptists who own slaves. Abolitionism. William Wilberforce in England. By 1804, all slaves in the North had been emancipated. By 1833, slavery is abolished in England by an act of Parliament. A Baptist missionary by the name of William Knibb helps Jamaica after abolition. British Baptists pushed their American brethren for abolition. In 1834, two British pastors come over here and visit American churches, and they write a book, and they push for abolition among the Baptists here in the U.S. Baptists participate in abolition societies up north. They begin holding conventions on abolition. Baptists in the South push back. Richard Furman, Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Richard Furman writes in 1822 an exposition on the views of the Baptists relative to the colored population of the United States. He argues that slavery is economically necessary and morally justified. After all, isn't it better for these people to be slaves and be Christians than to be barbarians? We're doing them a favor. And it was economically necessary. Now, the reality was the American economy depended upon slavery. And a lot of the Old South money came from slavery. Richard Fuller, domestic slavery considered as a scriptural institution. Fuller said the Bible never prohibits slavery. He entered a debate with famous Northern Baptist Francis Wayland, and he said, I'll give you my slaves if you can improve their condition. This leads me to this next fellow here, J.B. Jeter, who was pastor of First Baptist Church in Richmond. And Richmond had a colored church that was 4 times as large as the white church that eventually became one of the first African-American Baptist churches in the United States, pastored by a white pastor. Jeter writes a book and talks about his experience with slavery, and he basically says, I don't know what to do to get rid of slaves. It was against the law to emancipate your slaves. And if you emancipate the slaves, what would they do? Where would they go? How would they care for themselves? I mean, once slavery was established, it was a wretched institution that was very, very difficult to do away with. It took the American Civil War and the absolute bloodbath of the American Civil War to break back slavery. The Triennial Convention split over slavery. Southern Baptists, see, up until 1845, all the Baptists participated in the Triennial Convention, funding for it. The Southern brethren, when slavery got to be an issue, said, well, what are you going to do if we want to appoint a slaveholder to work in the South? Well, that would be. They appoint James Reeve, and they reject him because he's a slaveholder. And then the Alabama resolutions, the state convention asked pointedly if slave owners could be appointed as missionaries, and the board responded no. Baptist division was announced. There's an interesting book that I read, Broken Churches, Broken Nation. Part of the reason why the United States sundered over slavery is because the churches sundered over slavery. Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists all split over slavery. If the churches couldn't figure this out, it's no wonder the country. This brings me to the birth, just quickly, of African American Baptists. A number of very important names. George Lyle. Many of these early Baptist, black Baptist pastors are slaves who become converted and either buy their way out of slavery or are emancipated by their owners and become preachers. George Lyle, Andrew Bryan, First Baptist, Black Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, considered the Mother Baptist Church in the United States. And then Lot Carey, he was he was a slave in Virginia, worked in the tobacco warehouses, eventually earned enough money to buy he and his children out of slavery, and he was helped in the formation of the Black African Missionary Society, and he went to Liberia and started the First Baptist Church in Liberia. Liberia, liberty. One of the solutions to slavery was the African Colonization Society. Let's send the slaves home. Home being back to Africa. The problem is the slaves weren't necessarily from Liberia. They were from up and down the Gold Coast. It would be like saying, okay, we're going to send Jason back to Montana because he's from the West. Well, Jason, I don't have anything to do with Montana. It doesn't matter. We're going to send him to Montana. Well, I don't want to go to Montana. You don't have a choice. Well, you can't do anything out in Montana. Now, my problem, the African Colonization Society was a poor substance. I've already mentioned the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. And with the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention over slavery, they're also going to have trouble with another issue. Here's the four founding fathers of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary: James Pettigrew Boyce, John Albert Broadus, Basil Manley, and William Williams. Now, in just about 5 minutes, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story about these gentlemen and their relation to slavery. And I'm going to skip through Boyce, because we have another problem that ends up creating problems for the Baptists. And that is the issue of liberalism. I didn't turn the animations off on this. Theological crisis. And I'm just going to have one slide to mention this, and then I'm going to put up my last few slides and we'll be done with some questions. We come now to the formation of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where Jason and I went to school. Early in their history, they had trouble with theological criticism. Crawford Howell Toy went to Germany. The guy was so smart, he completed his seminary education. Back in the day, not when Jason went. Jason did his MDiv and stuff. You had to take a certain number of classes to graduate. It didn't matter how smart you were. You have to take the classes to graduate. In Crawford Howell Toy's day, if you could pass the tests, you could graduate. So students could study and take tests and get the degree. And Crawford Howell Toy graduated in 1 year because he passed the tests. He went to Germany where he learned higher critical thinking, came back to Southern, and began teaching higher critical views on the Old Testament, and had to leave the seminary over theological liberalism. Yet another cause for division among the Baptists. The atonement, communion, slavery, liberalism are just 4 of the reasons why we have so many Baptists today. Now, let me put up 6 more slides and bring the conversation. What about Baptists? This takes us up to the beginning of the 20th century. While it would be delightful talk about more of the gaps. What about contemporary challenges in Baptist life today? Things that just won't go away. This is a picture taken about a year ago at Saddleback Church, California, at the ordination of 3 women on the pastoral staff. Now, why is this significant? Because the pastor, Rick Warren, and the church have historically been a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's just one of the issues that plague contemporary Baptist life. But let's go back to the bigger issue, the issue of racism. Racism did not end at the end of the Civil War. I've given you a timeline, as it were, from the Civil War to the present. Slavery ends. It ends with the Emancipation Proclamation. But, you know, there was a big issue made over Juneteenth this summer, because Juneteenth is the actual June 19th, 1865, marks the actual end of slavery in the U.S. when federal troops entered Galveston, Texas, and the last of the American slaves were emancipated. And so that's where we get this idea of Juneteenth. Reconstruction is the period when the federal government sends troops into the South to rebuild the South and to see that the blacks have freedom. For 12 years, Northern troops are stationed in the South, ensuring a measure of freedom for the freed slaves. But it was costly, financially and politically. And in 1877, there were still troops in South Carolina. And when Rutherford Hayes was elected president, in order to get South Carolina to ratify his election, he had to withdraw the troops. And that was the end of it. when the Northern troops left the South, we entered into a period in the South of deplorable. We talk about the era of Jim Crow, 1877 to 1964. Among the things that happened during Jim Crow, 4,400 lynchings. Now, I'll be real honest with you. We just came through the George Floyd situation. I'm sympathetic to our African. I'm sympathetic. In fact, in the middle of George Floyd thing, I was at a park with my grandchildren in 2003, and I walked over to an African American. I said, "Sir, I'm really sorry for, the trauma of yesterday." The three white men in Georgia were sentenced to life without parole for killing Ahmaud Arbery, for jogging. We still have a problem. We still have a problem. And, what can I say? It's still a problem. Now, what does this have to do with the church? The Great Migration took place between 1910 and 1970, where 6 million Southern blacks moved north. Then we have the Civil Rights era of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act 64, the Voting Rights Act 65, and the Fair Housing Act 1968, and of course Martin Luther King. He was a Baptist. Another kind of Baptist, educated in a liberal school in the North. Martin Luther King described Sunday at 11 o'clock as the most segregated hour. In the South, the deacons stood at the back door of the church and would not allow it. Now, during the days of racial tension, Africans tried to enter the church, and so there was a lot of conflict in churches. As late as 2000, beginning of the 2000s, I'm down in Georgia, attending a white church. Now, we had one African. I didn't go to it was just a church we had while I was doing my PhD, but there weren't very many Africans. And I come to find out, I'm talking to an older gentleman in the church, and all of a sudden he uses a racial slur. I didn't know what to say. He's one of the leaders of the church. And he asked me whether I liked that blank music. I wish I'd had the presence of mind. He was about 25 years older than me. It would have really been disrespectful, but I wish I had said, "Did your mama teach you to speak like that?" Another older gentleman. It was just absolutely ungodly. The Southern Baptist Convention has been trying to deal with its racist acts. 1995, on the 150th anniversary of the convention, they passed a resolution. 2012, they elect Fred Luter, the first African American president of the SBC. In 2018, there's the Martin Luther King 50 conference, and Southern Seminary issues a history on racism. Have you read it? Very interesting story about how the early founders of the seminary all owned slaves. That's a fact of history. 2019, there was a resolution adopted by the convention embracing critical race theory. There's another worm I'm throwing on the table. Jason's going to have to tell you what critical race theory is and why it's important. This last summer, there was an effort to repeal Resolution 9 that failed. The Southern Baptists are still arguing over the extent of their racism. Another problem is sexual misconduct. You probably have heard the name Rachel Den Hollander. She was the first former USA gymnast to accuse Larry Nassar in 2016 of sexual inappropriate behavior when she was a young gymnast. The Me Too movement actually started in 2006. It was popularized with Harvey Weinstein in 2017 when all these Hollywood actresses kept saying Me Too. They were, they had to do sexual favors for Harvey Weinstein to get anywhere in Hollywood. And then it hits Baptist churches. The Houston Chronicle did an expose on the Southern Baptist Convention in February. They did one on the Independent Baptists, too. And by the way, as Amy's already pointed out, these problems don't just exist in Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, lots of people have the same. I'm just talking about family problems. David Sills, did you have Sills for class? David Sills was a missiologist at Southern Seminary. Very ugly scandal. It was a very ugly scandal. Very ugly scandal. In 2021, that's this summer, the convention voted that the executive committee would do an investigation and they would be required to waive attorney privilege. It took them 3 weeks to agree to do that. Ronnie Floyd, the president, a very difficult situation. And then the last issue is women in the pulpit. I mean, right now, this is an issue. The first SBC woman to be ordained was in 1964, Addie Davis, at Watt Street Baptist Church, first woman ordained to the gospel ministry. In 83, the Southern Baptists formed a committee, Women in Ministry, to talk about how to help and encourage women in ministry. By 1984, the Southern Baptists adopt a resolution promoting the ordination of women, 1984. Within a few years, there are 500 ordained women in the SBC, 18 of them serving as pastors. The conservative resurgence, which was then underway, put a stop with Article number 6 of the Baptist Faith and Mission. So we talked about the Second London Confession, 1689, and the Hampshire Confession, 1833. The Baptist Faith and Message is the Southern Baptist doctrine statement that generally governs the churches. It was written in 1925. It was amended in 1963. The last revision. In the 2000 revision, they added this: while both men and women are gifted for service in the church, the office of the pastor is limited to women as qualified by Scripture. Bring it up to 2021. 2020, Baylor University scholar by the name of Beth Allison Barr writes a book, The Making of Biblical Women, in which she argues that patriarchy is a cultural issue, and there is pressure to overthrow complementarianism. Beth Moore is the leading Southern Baptist women's Bible study. Saddleback ordains 3 women in 2021, and now the SBC is in the middle of debating again on racism, sexual misconduct, things of this sort. Now you say that's all Southern Baptist. I don't know where I don't know what your relationship is. As part of the Baptist family, it's just pretty hard for us to ignore what the big brother is. And in that issue, and because your pastor and I are both graduates of Southern Baptist School, that influences us to some extent. These men that we studied under are our friends, our heroes, our mentors, and we watch with grief or shame or joy or whatever the things that go on there. So that's kind of a brief survey of where Baptists are. We're not out of the woods yet. By the way, some of the, the interesting thing is, before all of this got going, they were still arguing about Calvinism and Arminianism, Southern Baptist. That was a big deal. But, nobody hears about that anymore because the sexual abuse thing got to be so big. People are forgetting. Why talk about Calvinism and Arminianism? All right, I'll take as many questions as you'd care to try to throw at me. Don't kid yourself. Well, I'm not. I'm just curious. They're all Al Mohler disciples. Yeah. They're not. Calvinism is not. Okay. I went to Southern. I know Al Mohler. Al Mohler knows me. We're not besties, but he would know who I am to greet me. I go to ETS and show up at the Southern Seminary reception every year, and he'll call me by name. I've been through the ropes there. Al Mohler is a Calvinist, sure. But Al Mohler is first. And there's an effort to hold the denomination together. The denomination is 17 million churches. No, sorry. 17 million people, 40,000 churches. And those are just odd. Interesting. You know about the G3 conference in Georgia? Okay. Well, there's a new. All right. So T4G. You know T4G. Last conference, this April. Last one they're done. Interestingly enough, they're holding the conference in Louisville, but Al Mohler. Now, T4G started off with C.J. Mahaney, Al Mohler, Ligon Duncan, and Mark Devlin. They brought in MacArthur. They brought in Piper. They're bringing in Alistair Begg. John MacArthur is kind of broken. John's kind of C.J. Mahaney got drummed out over sexual misconduct in his group. So it's been Mohler and Duncan and Dever, and then John Piper. Well, Mohler has decided he's not participating this year. So this is the last T4G. A conference, you've got MacArthur's West Coast Shepherds Conference, which is still going on. MacArthur is 82 now, right? I don't think the conference has got a lot of life in it. Do you think MacArthur's going to be preaching at 99? If he can, he will. He can, he will. And he's the ever-ready bunny. He just keeps going and going and going. But there's a new conference called G3 in Atlanta. Josh Bruce So I think he's a Southern Baptist. Anyway, he's just left over some of this stuff. And it's a new up and coming sort of rising star. I don't know where it's going to go. Owen Strand. You know the name Owen Strand, Jason? Owen Strand has left Midwestern. Yes, he is. So it's just interesting to see the shifting. There's a conversation that there's a new fundamentalist Southern Baptist, which is another conversation. So who knows? The landscape is shifting. Anyway, other questions or comments? Toby. Okay, regular Baptists were essentially particular Baptists when they started. And so, theoretically, if you see such and such regular Baptists, you know that their heritage is in this particular Baptist stream. That's less true today than it was 150 years ago. The regular Baptists, though, in New England, they were the equivalent of the British Baptists. The Free Will Baptists were the equivalent of the General Baptists. The regular Baptists were the equivalent of the particular. Generally speaking. I don't know, what did I say? The Free Will were General Baptists. The regular Baptists were particular. I might have said it back.
Second question: what happened to
Well, the
Northern Baptists after the
Northern Baptists in 1845. Okay, so Baptists were just Baptists. They weren't too conscious of their geography before 1840. They were just Baptists. They were all cooperating together. In fact, they weren't even too concerned about Canada and the U.S. They were just one big happy family. And Baptists went north and south and all over the place, just serving the church. With 1845, you now have the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention, and now geography. In the aftermath of slavery, the Southerners were afraid the Northerners would come down and impose their sensibilities on race on Southern churches. So now geography becomes more important because the issue now is what to do with the emancipation. The Northern Baptists are much more progressive. Read that liberal as time goes. They embrace liberalism sooner than Southern. The Northern Baptists really are heavily involved in the fundamentalist modernist. To some extent, there are Southern Baptists involved. The Northern Baptists form a convention in 1908. They form a convention, and that has been renamed. And so today, the Northern Baptist Convention of 1908 is now the American Baptist Church of the USA. I think 19. Now, a lot of churches have left. They either left and became Southern Baptists, and Southern Baptists no longer refers to the geography of the South. You have Southern Baptists. It's just really weird. We lived in Canada for 19 years. If you're a Southern Baptist church, if you're in Canada. The Southern Baptists have tried to rename themselves, get rid of the geography, and they want to get rid of the legacy of slavery. There's no practice. There's no good name to it. So they remain Southern Baptists with the issue of renaming. So you have Southern Baptists in Canada. You have Southern Baptists in the North. There are Southern Baptists. They're affiliated with the convention. And so now it's And to be affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, you just have to be and which entitles you to send delegates to the annual convention. The rest of the story regarding I slept since. Oh yes, that is what I meant. And the issue was in 2018. So here they are. You know, you got the Me Too movement percolating with the issue of sexual. Church is not dealing well with sexual misbehavior on the part of church members and church staff. That's percolating in churches. What do we do when a church member, or worse, a pastor? Now you've got several issues here. You've got adultery, which is biblically wrong but not legally wrong. There's no law in the United States against adultery. There's a law in the Bible against adultery, but not wrong. So people commit adultery and they're not in violation of law, but there is laws against forced sexual behavior or sex with children. Those are both immoral and illegal. And how churches deal with accusations on the part of members or leadership that are involved in any of those things becomes an issue. Of course, you know the Ravi Zacharias scandal. As far as I know, he didn't break any laws, except the law of God. Maybe the law matters, but whatever. All right, so that's all been going on. But then there's the issue of racism. And in 2018, in the middle of that, in 2018, Southern Purdue, because there's been a call for reparation, which is all of the stuff that slaves did for America did for free. Slave labor built the White House. Slave labor built all these things. And the question is, should somebody repay them for their ancestors? Al Mohler commissioned a study on the relationship between the seminary and slavery. Al Mohler used to be the Joseph Emerson Brown. He used to hold the Joseph Emerson Brown chair of society. Joseph Emerson Brown was a Civil War era governor who, after the Civil War, ran the Dade County coal mines and used the convict leasing system. Emancipated slaves were arrested for vagrancy, and they were sold as workers in the mines. It was slavery by books. Joseph Emerson Brown made enormous amount of money on convict leasing African Americans. And one inmate said, if there's a hell on earth, and so he no longer is the Joseph Emerson. He stopped. Legacy. He gave the seminary $50,000, which was earned. They lay all this out in this 75 or 100-page book. A group of African Americans asked for Southern to give up, I think it was $100 million of their endowment to go toward Simmons in reparation. And the demand for reparations is ongoing. Who do you pay and how much do you pay? So Southern's history, I mean, it is what it is. I was thinking about that, and as I've taught Baptist history over the years, I never talked about African American Baptists. I mean, who cares about it? Right? Now, I don't mean that because that's what I believe. I just never heard African American history in my studies. So consequently, I never brought it to my students. But as time went on, I realized this is a missing part of my history. And so as time went on, same thing with women. Even if I don't believe in women in the pulpit, women have played a significant role in church history. I began to add women's stories into my notes. There's a robust African American Baptist history. Now, obviously, there was only time to tell so much of it here. But there's a big story to be told, and there's so much of the story that we didn't even scratch the surface. We didn't talk about landmarks. Not at all. We didn't talk about the Campbellite controversy. Two more controversies that have separated Baptists one from another. As if we haven't covered enough of them. Two more. There's all kinds of these issues out there that have created problems for Baptists. These three that I ended with are just three of the most current ones that are agitating the largest Baptist group. And by the way, the sexual misconduct thing, I don't know, what do you consider yourself? Are you part of any group? You're just unaffiliated. Okay. Even among the unaffiliated Baptists, we've had our share of misconduct. Now, the nice thing about being unaffiliated, you say, well, we don't do anything. And that's the way I was in Canada. I didn't like the term independent because it makes it sound like we're not dependent on anybody. We were just unaffiliated. In fact, the church in Windsor that I pastored, it was started off as a Bible church. It entered the convention in Ontario, but the convention was grappling with things like homosexuality. So the church, they actually had a Free Will Baptist pastor who took the church out of the convention. There was thought about the church joining the Baptist Fellowship, Michael Haken's group, but they didn't. And so by the time I became pastor there, they were just unaffiliated. And I used to just talk about us being unaffiliated. And part of the reason they were unaffiliated is that they didn't want to take sides in some of these conflicts, because some of the sides had to do with teaching Shields. And there was a pro-Shields group and an anti-Shields group, and they wanted to be friends with both people. So they were just unaffiliated. So, there's all these groups out there. Some of them, are theologically defined. Others are over practical issues. Others are personality driven. Baptists are there's as many Baptists as there are cans of soup. Other questions? Comments? Well, I go to an unaffiliated church. Pastor Flink, I go to Berean Baptist Church up in Brooklyn Park. He grew up in the Iron Range, up in Grand Rapids, up near Ken Gilly, I think is where he grew up. And he went to college. He went to Central Seminary. 40 years ago. But he's just been pastoring in the state of Minnesota. And it's just an unaffiliated group. Well, thank you for your patience and time. I hope this has been a blessing. Nobody fell on the floor dead. I guess we'll see you tomorrow. Lord willing, and the creek doesn't rise. Brother, why don't you close us in prayer?